I always thought the end of the world would be louder. Something grand with screaming, panic, fire raining from the sky, and the president giving a dramatic speech against the backdrop of a planet exploding. But it turned out to be quieter, calmer, almost ordinary. I was sitting in my cabin, poking at some protein paste, and listening to an old track from Earth when the stars started going out. Not metaphorically, literally. First one, then another, then a third. In 10 minutes, a sector that had 20 inhabited worlds became nothing. The monitoring systems blared alarms, but I just stared out the viewport, unable to understand how a whole star could simply disappear. Then, the reports came. No contact, no communication, no planets. And then someone said it was them, the reborn. That was the first time I heard that word, and I didn't think much of it. But within a day, all of humanity knew it wasn't a natural disaster, a malfunction, or a cosmic accident. It was an attack. The first one. I was 37 then, and I thought of myself as an experienced navigation engineer. I'd been through 3 expeditions into the outer sectors, seen Andromeda rise and bloom, the center of human civilization, the jewel of the galaxy. We believed we had become gods. Humans controlled matter, created stars, even experimented with black holes. We feared nothing. Even the void seemed like a resource waiting to be used. But after that night, everything changed. The reborn came from dark matter, from parts of the universe where even light couldn't reach. They called themselves the First. They believed we had stolen their galaxy, that our cities stood on the bones of their world. And as strange as it sounds, I almost understood them. When you watch humanity's fleets devour everything in their path, it's hard to deny we had taken too much. The first days of the war were strangely beautiful. I can't think of a better word. Space burned, reflecting like a billion mirrors on fire. Gravitational waves distorted the stars, and it looked like the sky was dancing. People screamed, ran, prayed, but it all seemed pointless when your enemy could erase entire systems. Our defense satellites broke down, shields melted, the fleet trembled like paper. Admiral Vane ordered a retreat to Neoterra, humanity's last fortress. I was among those reprogramming the hyper corridors to give civilian ships a chance to escape. I remember watching the screen filled with hundreds of dots, each one a ship, and then they started disappearing, one after another. I didn't know who exactly was dying, but I felt every loss like an electric shock. When we reached Neoterra, the capital, the world was no longer the same. The planet had turned into a massive refugee camp. People slept right on the streets. Generals argued with scientists about who was to blame and what to do next. Some wanted to surrender, others to strike first, but no one even knew who we were really fighting. I saw the reborn only once through footage from a forward probe. They didn't look alive in any way we could understand. Their ships were organic, like the bodies of giant creatures pulsing, breathing, as if they had hearts. Some scientists said those weren't ships at all, but the beings themselves. I didn't believe it until I saw one of those ships tear apart a satellite station without a single shot, just by compressing the space around it. That's when I realized that all our weapons, our antimatter cannons and armor shields, were just toys compared to what the darkness could do. The worst part wasn't that they killed us. The worst part was that they understood us. They knew how we thought, how we built fleets, how we made decisions. Every defensive line we built collapsed, not because they were stronger, but because they predicted us. Some believed they could read minds, others thought they were us, just older, stripped of humanity. I dismissed it then, but deep down, I felt it might be true. Their maneuvers, their logic, even their cruelty felt too familiar. Like looking into a mirror that reflects not your face, but what you might become if you live too long in darkness. I often think back to that night when it all began. Sometimes it feels like the reborn didn't come to destroy us. Maybe they just wanted to remind us that for every star we lit, someone else would have to pay the price. We thought we had conquered the galaxy, but maybe the galaxy just wanted to take back its peace. I don't know if anyone I knew survived. I don't even know if Neo-Terra still exists. I'm flying now through the void in an old scout ship, watching space flicker with strange light. Maybe it's them, or maybe it's just what's left of what used to be humanity. And honestly, I'm not even sure anymore which of us were the monsters. I saw the fleet die. Not the ships, not the people. The fleet itself, like a living organism slowly but inevitably losing its pulse. It started with a faint shudder through the hull, as if something enormous had grabbed our cruiser and given it a slight shake. Then came the light, not a flash, not a beam, but a dense, blinding wave that bent space itself. The screens went dark, the instruments screamed, and then there was silence. Only silence. The Alfira sector became a silent graveyard. Ships scattered across orbits, burning like candles in an inky void. I remember the captain saying communication was lost with all units, but even without confirmation, it was obvious. We had lost. Gravitational bombs. No one even knew how to describe them. They didn't explode. They broke space itself, tearing a piece out of the universe and throwing it back, dead. At that time, I was a navigation officer aboard the Eridan, a mid-class cruiser of the fourth line. We were holding near the orbit of Alfira 3 when it all began. In the center of the battle stood the flagship Helios Prime under Admiral Vane's command. I had seen him once before, during training, and thought he was the kind of man who couldn't retreat. He was one of those who could stare straight into fire without blinking, but even he understood. It was over. When the first gravitational vortex swallowed 3 of our frigates, the order to retreat came without hesitation. Someone said the admiral had considered destroying the flagship to keep its technology from the enemy, but then changed his mind, as if he sensed that the battle was no longer about ships, but about what would remain of humanity afterward. We activated the hyperdrives, and space around us thickened like syrup. Some ships didn't make it. They were pulled in, twisted, and caught their own reflections in distorted time. I saw the Solaris explode 3 times in the same place, but in different seconds. As we retreated, I watched the route map. All the hyperlanes humanity had used for centuries were flashing red. We were losing control of each one, as if someone was methodically cutting us off from the stars. After Alfira, only one stable route remained, the path to Neo-Terra. That's where what was left of the fleet was gathering, refugees, colonies, anything that could still be saved. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. Andromeda no longer belonged to us. That feeling was worse than fear, a mix of helplessness and the realization that we had simply been erased. I heard the engineers arguing about the nature of the bombs, that they operated on the principle of reverse singularity, that their energy wasn't created but subtracted. In essence, they didn't explode. They erased existence. And at some point, I realized that we would disappear the same way. Not die, just vanish. Without a trace, without memory, as if we had never been. When the Eridan exited the jump near Neo-Terra, the planet looked different. Its glow, once steady and calm, was now broken by flashes. Thousands of ships hung in orbit, but none looked ready for battle. They were all damaged, scorched, patched together. It didn't look like an army. It looked like refugees clinging to their last home. That's when I understood that the retreat orders weren't an act of cowardice, but a desperate attempt to save someone, anyone. We weren't fighting for victory anymore. We were fighting to be remembered. Admiral Vane gave a new order. Consolidate forces, restore the orbital shields, and hold Neo-Terra at any cost. And still, I could see in his eyes, even through the screen, that he didn't believe in victory. Sometimes, I think humanity lost long before Alfira. We became too confident, too loud in our belief that we could conquer the galaxy. We forgot that space belongs to no one. It simply allows you to exist until you cross the line. The Reborn's gravitational bombs weren't weapons. They were a warning, and we failed to understand it. As the fleet retreated, I felt space itself tremble, as if it were in pain. And I was ashamed to have survived, ashamed that in that moment I wasn't thinking about the fallen, but about how it all looked, as if someone were turning off the lights in a vast room where humanity had been too loud for too long. I'll never forget the first time I saw Neoterra from orbit. It glowed as if the galaxy itself was trying to protect it, like a child. The massive domes of the orbital stations sparkled in the sunlight, reflecting the bluish glow of the atmosphere, and beneath them, darkness, tense and uneasy, filled with millions of people who just wanted to survive. We stood on the edge of galactic collapse, and every one of us knew that this planet was the last line. Everything else had already been destroyed, burned away by gravitational bombs, turned into dust of dark matter. Sometimes I think we were already dead then. We just hadn't realized it yet. When I looked at Neoterra, I didn't see a planet. I saw the breath of humanity, cornered. And in a strange way, it felt like even the stars around it were watching with pity. The orbital shield was both our miracle and our curse. It was built in a rush, stitched together from technologies of different eras and civilizations, pieced like scrap metal made to fit. I saw engineers sleeping right on the panels, their hands shaking from exhaustion, but no one stopped. Everyone understood. If the shield didn't come online, that was it. The end. Below us, in the underground cities, lived millions of refugees. They no longer looked at the sky because they knew. That's where death came from. Sometimes, when the comms weren't overloaded, I could hear children crying through the channels. They cried when our ships flew over them. I don't know if there was more fear or hope in those cries. Maybe they just wanted someone, anyone, to hear them. Politics at that time became a poison that slowly killed what was left of reason. Generals argued with scientists, scientists argued with diplomats, and diplomats argued with the air itself. Some said we should surrender because there was no point in us anymore. Others demanded we keep fighting, even if it meant losing everything. I stood between them, a dusty, worn-out pilot whose hands trembled from fatigue, and thought that maybe both sides were wrong. We had already lost, but no one wanted to admit it. That's when she appeared, Commander Arya Kell. They say every war has people who become symbols without wanting to. Arya was one of them. I saw her for the first time at a briefing. She stood straight, unblinking, her gaze so cold it felt like you could see stars through it. She didn't speak loudly, but every word she said cut through the silence like a blade. She didn't try to persuade anyone, she just announced that her squadron, Helios, was preparing to launch into outer orbit to intercept enemy drones. And at that moment, the room fell silent. Not because everyone feared her, no. It was because no one could help but listen. Her voice carried something we had all lost, the sense that life wasn't over yet. I didn't know then that this feeling would cost us dearly. When her fleet took off, the shield was still incomplete. Half the sectors were running on backup power, and the generators overheated every 20 minutes. Arya knew it was suicide, but she went anyway. I watched from the hangar as her ship vanished into the silvery glow of the atmosphere, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something like pride. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was meaningless, but it was pride all the same. Later, I learned that she had taken out 3 enemy fleets before her signal disappeared. Her ship was never found, but for a long time debris drifted over Neoterra, and every pilot made it a ritual to look at it before flying out. As we built the shield and gathered what was left of our strength, the rumors about Helios turned into legend. People said Arya hadn't died. She had merged with the shield system, becoming its mind, its core. I didn't believe it until one night I heard a strange voice over the comm, short, hoarse, but strangely familiar. It said the barrier would hold for one more day. After that, the system burned out, but the planet survived. From that day, I stopped laughing at legends. Maybe she really did stay with us, not as a person, but as the last spark of what makes us human. Sometimes, I think that without her, it all would have ended sooner. But the truth is, Neoterra survived not because of technology or heroes. It survived because millions of people beneath its surface simply couldn't afford to die. They held on to life even as the sky fell. And me? I was just a witness to humanity dying and being reborn. And if anyone asks me where I was when the last star fell, I'll say, I was on Neoterra, and I saw one woman set the sky on fire to protect a home that was already burning. When it all began, I didn't even realize it was an assault. At first, it just seemed like regular radio interference, sensor overload, another false alarm, one of many we'd had during the war. But then, the darkness beyond the viewport seemed to come alive. Space split open, and ships of the revived spilled out. They didn't enter the system like we did, through navigation gates or hypercorridors. No, they grew straight out of the void, like mushrooms after rain. I stood on the command deck, watching the instruments go haywire, gravity readings fluctuating as if physics itself were trying to resist their presence. That's when I first felt not fear, but a strange, sticky sensation, like cold fingers brushed against my mind and whispered, "We're already here." Minutes later, the sky above Neoterra turned completely black, and the orbital screens filled with bursts of light. That's how the battle began, lasting 11 hours, though it felt like a lifetime. Our first volleys were useless. Projectiles vanished into nothing, beams broke apart mid-air. It was as if the space around the enemy was trembling, shifting, adapting to every hit. General Kane's fleet tried a frontal assault and disappeared completely. No explosions, no distress signals, just gone. That's when we realized we weren't facing an enemy made of flesh and metal, but something that chose where to exist. The bridge went silent except for the hum of the generators and the flicker of indicators. No one gave orders. Everyone waited for Commander Kell to speak. When her voice finally came through the comms, it was calm, almost weary. She told us to take defensive positions and not to attack, as if she knew that any movement would only hasten the end. Neoterra's shield held for the first 4 hours. With each impact, it cracked, flashed with blue discharges like an overloaded grid. In the infrared spectrum, it glowed as if burning from within. From orbit, it looked as though the planet was wrapped in a giant dome of light that was slowly melting. I remember one of the engineers saying the field couldn't hold any longer, and then Command authorized the use of antimatter cannons. That decision meant everything. Those weapons were built in an era when humanity still played God. No one was ever meant to use them. They didn't just erase matter, they tore the structure of space itself. When the first cannon fired, time seemed to stop. The entire system flared in white light so bright, even filtered screens couldn't protect our eyes. Vision burned, and the air on the bridge trembled like before a storm. And then came silence. We lost half our ships. Plasma waves cut through defenses, slicing cruisers apart like paper. I saw one of our vessels, the Sphere of Mars, try to maneuver, but its turn ended in a collision. The explosion was so strong that the shockwave threw us off course, even in another sector. The revived lost part of their forces too, according to telemetry, but they didn't seem to care. They moved on, cold, methodical, unhurried, like a predator that knows the prey can't escape. At some point, I noticed the communication signals fading one by one. Central command nodes failed. We were left without coordination. Every ship was now on its own. Every captain decided how to die. Arya Kell didn't surrender. Her flagship, battered and nearly without shields, kept collecting debris of the surviving ships. She pulled along anything that could still fly: transports, drones, escape pods. I don't know how she had the strength or the fuel, but her ship moved as if powered by pure will. She led what was left of the fleet to the rear positions, where engineering stations still held. That's when I realized she wasn't just an officer. She was a symbol that we still had a soul. Even when orbit turned into a graveyard, she refused to retreat without a fight. When her cruiser entered the dense layers of the atmosphere, the communication system sent one last signal: reactor overload, full merge with the shield network. And then the dome over Neo-Terra blazed. I saw that light with my own eyes. It wasn't white or blue. It was the color of farewell. From that moment, the revived retreated. Not because we won, but because they probably got what they came for. We were left in silence among the wreckage with the feeling that we survived by accident. I stood by the command deck window, watching through broken panels as the remains of our satellites slowly orbited the planet, like dead beacons of hope. I thought then that maybe all of this was a test. Maybe someone up there was watching to see who would remain human when the stars stopped shining. And if that's true, Arya Kell passed the test. The rest of us, we were only witnesses to how one person held an entire civilization from disappearing. I didn't realize right away what had gone wrong. At first, it was just a strange noise in the engines, then a navigation glitch, and a minute later we were flying through a hyper corridor that should have been closed according to every calculation. I sat in the pilot's seat, gripping the control stick like my life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. Space around the shuttle trembled like the surface of water after a stone's been thrown in. I saw the stars bend, as if someone was tugging at them by invisible strings. Everything inside was vibrating, and even the navigation system's voice echoed oddly, like it was speaking from another dimension. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no way back. We had entered a tunnel created long before humanity existed, and now it would decide whether to spit us out or swallow us forever. When Admiral Vane announced Operation Heart of Darkness, I thought it was just another desperate attempt to save what had long been lost. We'd lost half the galaxy, the fleet was shattered, the capital was under siege, and our allies had started turning on each other like starving animals. But when the scientists showed us the map of hypercorridors, those ancient, unstable tunnels leading straight into the center of the Revived's territory, I felt something click inside me. It was a chance, a crazy, suicidal one, but still a chance. I volunteered without being asked, just walked up to the commander and said I wanted to pilot the Helios Prime, the flagship cruiser. He looked at me like I was insane, then nodded. Maybe in moments like that, madness is the only thing that still works. Preparing for the mission felt like a wedding in hell. 12 cruisers, each commanded by representatives of different races, allies of humanity. And if you think diplomacy is boring, try putting in one room a captain from Sirius who communicates only through sense and a representative of the Catal species who has no voice but uses telepathy that only works in complete silence. We argued, shouted, went quiet, and argued again. At one point, one of the captains even tried to bite another. I'm not kidding. Vane said it was normal, that this was what strategic alignment looked like. I didn't ask which strategy he meant. Meanwhile, the engineers worked on the Helios Prime, reinforcing the hull, tuning the neural interface, checking the antimatter reactors. I slept 2 hours a night, 8 when I remembered, and kept wondering what would happen if the hypercorridor collapsed mid-jump. When we finally launched, I felt everything inside me tighten. Space around the shuttle started to warp, as if invisible hands were squeezing it from outside. We entered the corridor, and the madness began. Communication between ships was lost in 20 seconds. Navigation started showing impossible coordinates, like Vector 9 through the axis of fear. I'm not kidding. That's what it said on the screen. Then came the hallucinations. I saw glowing creatures running through the cockpit, heard my mother's voice. She'd been dead for 10 years and smelled rain, even though we were in a vacuum. One of the ships vanished, just dissolved in space. Another started firing on its own fleet, thinking it was under attack. I tried to hold the course, but every meter felt like a leap into the unknown. Of 12 cruisers, only 7 made it out. The rest were either destroyed or trapped in realities we couldn't understand. When we emerged from the hypercorridor, a sphere appeared before us. A massive, living planet, pulsing with both light and darkness. It was the heart of the revived, the collective mind controlling their armies. I looked at it and felt something tremble inside me. Not fear, recognition. We were connected. I didn't know how, but I could feel it. Later, the scientists confirmed it. The revived were genetic remnants of ancient humans, exiled into the dark long ago. We were fighting our own descendants. They didn't want revenge. They wanted back the energy we'd stolen from their sun. Everything we called progress, for them, it was theft. I sat in the cockpit, staring at the living planet, and thought, maybe we really were the barbarians, just with prettier ships. The battle began suddenly. Thousands of ships, energy waves, explosions, voices screaming over comms. Helios Prime broke through to the core, and I personally entered the central zone, inside the living planet. It felt like being in a dream. The walls breathed, light pulsed, and the air shimmered with visions, memories, fears, hopes. I found the central sacred point, the mind of the heart. I connected through the neural interface, and in that instant, everything changed. I saw their history, their pain, their loneliness. They hadn't wanted war. They wanted to be heard. I activated the memory resonator, a device meant to unite minds. A burst of hyper-energy erased the core, part of the fleet, but created a new current, a bridge between races. I felt my body fading, but my mind remained. I became part of the light. After the thunder of the interstellar wars finally faded and the galactic dust settled over the ruins of the old empires, I faced an existential question. Where was my true place in this post-catastrophic universe? My current state and location remain uncertain. Maybe my consciousness is trapped inside a great restored beacon that shines like a guiding star in orbit around the rebuilt planet Neoterra, serving as a symbol of hope for all wanderers. Or perhaps I exist only as an immaterial memory, an echo in the collective mind of the few who survived the furnace of destruction. Though the galaxy, torn apart by unimaginable war, seemed beyond repair, something incredible happened. The surviving scattered fleets, unbroken by grief, united. That union gave birth to an entirely new civilization, full of determination. The human revived. Their mission is ambitious and noble, to build a world where power and destructive weapons no longer rule, but where intellect, wisdom, and compassion become the foundation. As for my modest role, it's simple. I tell this story, passing it from mouth to mouth and mind to mind, so that anyone seeking meaning in this chaos knows one truth. Even in the deepest darkness, there's always a glimmer of light, of salvation, of rebirth, of a future. All it takes is the courage to step toward that light, overcoming the primal fear of the unknown and of change. If someone had told me back then that I'd end up in the middle of the strangest diplomatic mission in human history, I probably would have laughed and gone back to cleaning stabilizers on the lower deck. But everything changed the day we were summoned to Neoterra's main hangar. I stood among hundreds of pilots, engineers, and commanders, watching as a diagram of the hyper corridor slowly rotated on the screen. An ancient, unstable, almost mythical tunnel that, according to scientists, led straight into the heart of the Revived's territory. Vane, our admiral, said this was our only chance. No speeches, no inspiration, just a chance. And I knew I wanted to be part of it, not for glory, not for revenge, simply because if we didn't try, everything would end. And there I was, standing before the hull of the Helios Prime, the flagship cruiser, feeling a tremor deep inside, not from fear, from realizing I was now part of something far greater than myself. Forming the fleet was like trying to assemble an orchestra out of wild beasts, each thinking it was the conductor. 12 cruisers, each commanded by representatives of different races, humanity's allies. And if you think interstellar diplomacy means dull meetings in a conference hall, you've clearly never seen a Tarkhan captain throw a translator at a wall because he misinterpreted his ritual roar. I watched the serious delegates argue with those from Catal, a species without vocal cords, whose telepathy only works in absolute silence. One of them just sat there staring and then apparently sent a thought that made the translator's nose bleed. Vane said it was normal, that this was what strategic alignment looked like. I didn't ask what kind of strategy he meant. Meanwhile, the engineers were preparing the Helios Prime, reinforcing the hull, tuning the neural interface, checking the antimatter reactors. I slept 2 hours a night, 8 when I remembered, and kept wondering what would happen if the hypercorridor collapsed mid-transition. The atmosphere in Neoterra's bunkers was completely different. There was no diplomacy, no strategy, only silence, broken by the sound of welding, guards' footsteps, and the occasional cry of children who didn't understand why they'd never see the stars again. People were preparing for the final defense. Some built fortifications, others recorded messages for future generations, though no one was sure there would be any. I saw an old man in a uniform from the first colonization era sitting by a wall, drawing a map, not a real one, but the one he remembered from childhood. He said that if everything ended, at least someone should remember what the galaxy looked like before the war. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and kept walking. Moments like that make you realize war isn't just ships and explosions, it's memory, and the fear of losing it. When the scientists opened the first hypercorridor, everything stopped. It wasn't just an event, it was like someone had opened a door to another reality. The corridor pulsed, warped, and emitted a strange sound, not a voice, not a signal, but something between breathing and a whisper. One of the technicians said it could be residual energy from an ancient civilization. Another claimed it was just noise from unstable waves, but I felt it wasn't just noise. It was an invitation, or a warning. We stood before that glowing tear in space, and no one spoke, not even Vane. He just watched. Then, he said we'd launch in 48 hours. I returned to the Helios Prime, sat in the pilot's chair, and activated the synchronization system. The display showed a single line: ready for transition. I didn't know what awaited us, but I knew there was no way back. If you've ever felt your body exist in several places at once, while your mind argues with itself in a language you don't know, congratulations. You've almost experienced what we went through crossing the hypercorridor. I can't clearly describe how it began because the launch seemed normal. Systems check, synchronization, ignition. But within seconds, the space around the Helios Prime began to warp as if someone were pulling at its edges. The stars disappeared. In their place were flashes of colors that don't exist in any spectrum. I saw the ship's hull reflecting shapes that weren't there. Navigation showed coordinates that, according to the technicians, couldn't exist in our universe. And then, silence. Total. The connection with the other ships broke off, and I was alone. Well, almost alone. Because a minute later, I started hearing voices. At first, I thought it was a glitch in the audio system. Then, I thought they were memories. But they didn't speak in my voice, or in anyone's voice from the crew. They were foreign thoughts, emotions, fears. I felt them seeping into me as if the hypercorridor wasn't just a tunnel, but a mind scanning us, studying us, tasting us. One voice spoke of losing a son, another of being exiled from his world for feeling too much. I didn't know who they belonged to, maybe remnants of those who'd passed through before, or maybe the resurrected themselves. I tried to shut down the neural interface, but it didn't respond. The system said everything was fine, but I knew better. We weren't fine anymore. We were inside something that shouldn't exist. A few minutes later, the hallucinations began. I saw beings running across the cabin, transparent, with eyes that looked right through you. One came close, and I felt my heart stop. Not from fear, from recognition. I knew it, though I'd never seen it before. It was part of me, or I was part of it. I closed my eyes, but the visions didn't fade. They slipped into my mind, my memory, my body. I felt the temperature shift, even though the sensors showed stability. I heard music that, as I later found out, others heard too, each their own. One captain said he heard his mother's voice, dead for years on Mars. Another saw his ship sinking in an ocean, though we were in a vacuum. It wasn't just a jump. It was a test. And not everyone passed it. By the third minute of flight, the system failures began. Hyperparasites, that's what the scientists later called them, had invaded the navigation core. They weren't alive in any usual sense. They were informational entities feeding on logic. They attacked algorithms, rewrote commands, created false signals. One ship began to turn, thinking it was under attack. Another dropped its shields, believing it had arrived. I tried to reach them, but the comms were dead. Only fragments came through, screams, noise, half-phrases. I saw one cruiser disappear, just dissolve in space. Another exploded when its systems overheated from conflicting commands. I couldn't help. All I could do was hold course and hope the Helios Prime held together. When we emerged from the corridor, I didn't realize it was over. Space stabilized, the stars returned, navigation worked again. I checked the roster. Of 12 ships, 7 remained. The rest were either destroyed or trapped in realities we couldn't understand. I felt exhaustion, as if I'd lived several lifetimes. The crew was in shock. Some were in comas. One technician just sat there repeating the same phrase. They're watching. I didn't ask who. I just activated the defensive protocols and sent a signal to Vane. We made it through. But I knew we weren't the same. The hyper corridor had changed us. And now, as we approach the heart of the resurrected, I'm not sure we're ready. But there's no turning back. We're already inside. I thought I'd seen everything. After Alfieri, after losing half the fleet in the corridor, after watching one ship literally vanish into a fold of space, I was sure nothing could surprise me anymore. But when we exited the final jump and saw it, the sphere, alive, pulsing, the size of a continent, I knew I was wrong. It wasn't a structure or a planet. It was a being, a mind, the heart of the resurrected. We hung in orbit, and even the most seasoned captains were silent. The navigation systems refused to identify the object. It had no mass, yet it pulled us in. No surface, yet it reflected light. I stared at it and felt something tremble inside me. Not fear, recognition. Like I'd been here before. Like this place knew me better than I knew myself. When the scientists began scanning the sphere's structure, they discovered it wasn't made of matter, but of intertwined energy streams, each carrying fragments of consciousness. It was a collective mind, not just a database or a network, but a living being made from memory, pain, and hope. And then we learned the truth. One biologist studying the genetic signatures said the structure of the resurrected wasn't alien at all. It was human, or what was left of a human colony exiled into the void thousands of years ago. They had mutated, adapted, merged, and now they'd returned, not as enemies, as forgotten children. I sat in the Helios Prime cockpit, trying to process it. We hadn't been fighting invaders. We'd been fighting those we had once abandoned. Arya, our commander, was the first to make contact. She connected to the neural interface tuned to the sphere's frequency. I watched as her body trembled, her eyes filled with light, and she began to speak words that didn't exist in our language. The scientists were recording, the technicians panicking, and I just watched. Because I felt it wasn't just communication. It was a return. Later, Arya said the mind of the sphere didn't want war. It wanted to take back what had been stolen. Energy. Light. The sun we used for our own needs, not knowing it was their source of life. We had destroyed their ecosystem, their memory, their home. And now they had come, not for revenge, for restoration. I didn't know how to react. Everything we had been taught was a lie. The enemies weren't enemies. And we weren't heroes. The fleet began preparing for the assault. Not because we wanted to destroy the sphere, because we didn't know how else to stop the conflict. Some captains demanded an attack, others called for negotiations, but there was no time. The sphere started expanding, and its fields began interfering with navigation. One of the ships lost orientation and crashed into an asteroid. We knew, if we didn't act, it would all be over. Arya suggested entering the sphere, not with weapons, with the mind. She said that if we could connect with the core, we could understand them. I didn't believe it, but she had already decided, and I followed her, because despite everything that had happened, I trusted her, and because deep inside, I still had hope that we could change everything. Entering the sphere felt like a dream. We passed through an energy rift and immediately found ourselves in a space that defied description. There was no gravity, no direction, no time, only images, memories. I saw scenes I didn't know, people I had never met, events that happened long before I was born. It was the sphere's memory, the memory of the reborn. They showed how they were exiled, how they survived in the dark, how they built new bodies, new forms, new thoughts, how they waited, and how they hoped we would return. I cried, not from pain, from shame. We had forgotten them, but they remembered us. Arya approached the core, a glowing node pulsing with the rhythm of life. She connected. And then, everything changed. I don't know how to describe what happened next. It wasn't an explosion, a flash, or a catastrophe. It was awakening. Arya activated the memory resonator, a device capable of merging minds. In that moment, I felt all thoughts, all feelings, all fears become one. We weren't a fleet anymore. We were a mind, shared. The sphere trembled, the light grew stronger, and I understood. We were no longer enemies. We were one. Arya disappeared into the stream of light. Her body dissolved, but her consciousness remained. Inside the sphere, inside us. We returned to orbit, without weapons, without orders, just with understanding, and with a new beginning. I don't know how to describe the sound that came the moment the battle began. It wasn't an explosion, or the roar of engines, or a scream. It was something ancient, as if the very fabric of space cried out in pain. We emerged from the hypercorridor, and before us stretched the armada of the reborn. Tens of thousands of ships, each glowing like a living being. They looked nothing like ours. No clear shapes, no reflection of light, only absorption. The space around them rippled like water under a hurricane. I sat in the pilot's chair of the Helios Prime and felt the hull vibrate from the approaching wave. Arya stood beside me, connected to the neural interface, her eyes glowing faint blue. She didn't speak, but I knew. She had already begun contact. And we had begun the battle. The first strike came from the flank. One of our allied cruisers, the Selena, was consumed by an energy storm that, according to the technicians, had no source. It just appeared. The wave passed through its hull, and the ship vanished. Not exploded, vanished. I saw the Selena's captain trying to transmit coordinates, but the signal was distorted, as if his voice was passing through 1,000 filters. We started maneuvering, but space itself was unstable. Every turn could mean collision with something invisible. I felt my fingers tighten on the control panel, my heart pounding in my throat. This wasn't just a battle. It was a test, and we were on the edge. The Helios Prime broke through the first line of defense. We used antimatter pulses that, according to calculations, should have pierced the Reborn's energy shields. But they adapted. Every strike we delivered, they absorbed, processed, and sent back. One of our cruisers was hit by its own pulse, reflected with millisecond precision. I realized we weren't just fighting a fleet, we were fighting a mind. The sphere we had discovered earlier began to pulse, and its waves interfered with navigation, communication, even consciousness. Some pilots began losing orientation. One of them, captain of the Atlantis, disabled his shields, thinking he was already in a safe zone. His ship was torn apart. I couldn't help. I could only move forward. Arya said we had to reach the core. I don't know how she knew, maybe through the neural interface, maybe through intuition. But I trusted her. We steered the Helios Prime toward the sphere's center, pushing through energy storms that, according to the engineers, defied physical laws. The space inside the sphere was different. There was no gravity, no time, only light and darkness. We entered a zone where the ship began losing its form, not physical, but logical. The system showed we were in 3 places at once. I turned off navigation and switched to manual control. Arya connected deeper. Her body trembled, but she didn't stop. I saw her consciousness link with the core. And then, everything changed. I felt space freeze around us, as if someone hit pause. All sounds vanished, all motion stopped, only light and a voice. Not Arya's voice, not the sphere's. A voice inside me. It said we had taken their sun, that we used its energy without realizing it was their source of life, that we had destroyed their ecosystem, their memory, their home. I didn't know how to respond. Everything we'd been taught was a lie. We thought we were defending our territory, but they only wanted back what was theirs. I felt shame and pain and hope, because despite everything, they didn't want to destroy us. They wanted to be heard. Arya activated the memory resonator. It was a device built to merge consciousness. She linked with the core, and I saw her body dissolve into the stream of light. Not disappear, become part of it. The sphere began pulsing harder, and a wave of energy swept through the fleet. Some ships were destroyed, some transformed. I felt my consciousness connect with others, with strangers, with them. We became a shared mind, not completely, but enough to understand, to feel, to forgive. Arya was gone, but her voice remained inside us, inside the sphere, inside the light. After the cataclysm that consumed entire star systems finally burned itself out and the destructive chaos gave way to fragile silence, we returned. Our return was not the triumph of conquerors raising flags over broken worlds, but the solemn march of witnesses, those who survived and must now bear the weight of memory for all that was lost. The galactic landscape had changed forever, a silent monument to an unimaginable tragedy. We had lost much, entire worlds, billions of lives, and perhaps most painfully, the old naivety and faith in the unshakable order. Yet through the crucible of suffering, we gained something greater, an understanding of the true nature of conflict. We realized that war is not just a mindless, brutal struggle for resources or territory, not just the clash of armies. Often, it's a desperate, muted cry for help from broken souls and dying civilizations. And now, if we learn to hear that cry, if we can rise above fear and ego, we might have a real chance to survive and build something better. I look up at the endless, shimmering stars and feel that this might be the beginning, the true beginning of a new era. An era without weapons, grounded in wisdom, without fear, fueled by compassion, but always carrying the memory of past mistakes and the unending hope for dawn. I saw Arya disappear, not die, disappear. As if her body became light, and that light became part of something greater than we could ever understand. It happened the moment she activated the memory resonator. The device, according to scientists, was designed to unite minds, not just sync data, not just share thoughts, but to create a single field of consciousness where there would be no I or they, only we. I stood beside her in the Helios Prime cockpit and felt space trembling around us, as if reality itself didn't know what to do with that impulse. First, a flash, then silence, and then an explosion, not physical, energetic. A hyper-energy wave passed through everything, ships, minds, time. I saw the sphere's core, the heart of the reborn, begin to crumble. Not break apart, but disintegrate, like sand that can no longer hold its shape. The fleet trembled. Some ships lost control, others just froze, as if waiting for something. I tried to restore communications, but the systems were overloaded, navigation displayed impossible coordinates, and the neural interface showed fragments of thoughts that weren't mine. I felt someone else's pain, someone else's hope, someone else's memories. It wasn't chaos. It was connection. We had become part of the stream that appeared after the resonator was activated. Later, scientists called it the bridge, a flow that links minds of different species, different forms of life, different histories. I didn't understand how it worked, but I felt it was right. That this was what we had been waiting for, not victory, not an ending, a beginning. Arya was gone, but her voice remained inside us, inside the bridge. When the wave passed, we began to recover. Slowly, carefully. Some ships were gone, completely. Others transformed. I saw one cruiser, previously damaged, begin to glow, as if its hull had become part of an energy field. The crew was alive, but changed. They spoke differently, thought differently. I didn't know what had happened to them, but they weren't dangerous. They were calm, as if they had understood something we hadn't yet realized. I tried to contact command, but the signal was unstable. So I just turned on the recorder and began to speak. So someone would hear. So someone would know what had happened. Because this couldn't be forgotten. It couldn't be repeated. It had to be understood. We returned to Neoterra's orbit after a few hours, or days. I'm not sure. Time inside the bridge was different. When we emerged, everything was quiet. The galaxy had changed, not physically, energetically. Space felt softer. The light, brighter. People, quieter. I saw engineers looking at the sky, children drawing new symbols, elders sitting in silence. Not from fear, from respect. We lost Arya, but we gained connection, a real one, without words, without orders, just understanding. I don't know where she is now. Maybe in the stream, maybe within us, maybe in those yet to be born. But I know she did what no one else dared to do. She gave herself for peace, for memory, for the future. Now, when I look at the stars, I don't see enemies. I see stories. Each one, a spark, a thought, a chance. We no longer divide the galaxy into sectors. We build bridges, not physical ones, energetic. Between minds, between worlds, between those who were and those who will be. I don't know how long this will last. Maybe it'll all collapse again. Maybe we'll start another war. But right now, there is silence and light and memory. I record this so you know, even in the deepest darkness, you can find a way. If someone chooses to become the light, Arya did, and we followed her. I didn't realize right away what had changed. After the memory resonator exploded, when the light consumed everything we knew and Arya vanished, there was silence. Not the kind that follows battle, when the engines power down and the crew falls quiet from exhaustion. This was different, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath. We drifted on the wreckage of the Helios Prime, without communication, without coordinates, without purpose. But no one panicked, no one screamed. We just looked at the stars, and each of us felt they had changed, softer, closer, as if someone had erased the boundaries between us and them. I didn't know if other ships were still alive. I didn't know if Neoterra still existed. But I knew one thing. The war was over. Not because we won, but because we understood. A few days, or hours later, I'm not sure, we received a signal. It was weak, barely detectable, but its structure was familiar. It was a beacon, not a normal one, an energy beacon, made not of metal, but of memory. It came from the orbit of the old capital. We directed what was left of the fleet there, and the closer we got, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a signal. It was a message. Arya had left it, not with her voice, not with words, with an image. Inside the beacon was her thought, her choice, her sacrifice. She hadn't died. She had become part of the bridge, and now the beacon transmitted her consciousness to anyone willing to listen. I connected to it, and in that moment I understood. We were no longer alone. We were part of something greater. The union of minds. Fleets began to gather, not by command, by instinct. Humans, the reborn, allied races, everyone who survived began moving toward the beacon, not to build a new army, to build a new civilization. We called it the human reborn, not because we wanted to keep the old name, but because it reflected what we were. We were human, and we were reborn. We were the ones who had made mistakes, and the ones who forgave. We began sharing knowledge, memories, energy, without barriers, without fear. I saw children of different species playing together, engineers from Sirius and Catal designing new engines, elders telling stories that had once been myths. We started to live, not survive. Live. In orbit around the old capital, we built a station, not a military one, not a research one, a transition point. It became our new origin. From here, a new journey began, beyond the galaxy. We no longer searched for enemies. We searched for meaning. The space beyond Andromeda was unexplored, full of danger, but no one hesitated. We were ready, because now we had the bridge, a connection that distance couldn't break. I signed up as a volunteer, not for glory, but because I felt that if we didn't move forward, everything we'd been through would be meaningless. I stood on the platform, looked at the stars, and knew Arya was watching us, not as a commander, as light. Before launch, I went to the beacon, just stood beside it. It didn't speak, but I felt warmth. As if someone embraced me from within, I remembered everything: Alfira, the hyper corridors, the visions, the battle, the sacrifice. And I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. We no longer divide ourselves by race, by fleets, by sectors. We are mind, we are memory, we are light. I entered the shuttle, powered up the system, and the screen displayed, "Ready for departure." I smiled, because I knew we weren't just leaving the galaxy. We were going beyond ourselves, and if Arya could become the light, then so can we.